So I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Deb Kramer. I'm with Keep Caddy Creek Beautiful, and a panel of us put together these Peninsula Watershed, South Bay Watershed forums every quarter. And we're a bunch of local community members, agencies, and organizations that are working on watershed related issues for the purpose of networking and sharing information, which we're going to be doing directly today through a talk with two wonderful presenters on trees in the urban landscape. As a group, we focus on watersheds in the Lower Peninsula and the South Bay. And past topics have included fish passage and habitat, water conservation, homeless encampments. We also just recently in September had one on the Coyote Creek watershed. So we'll try each year to pick off one of the watersheds that we can focus on. And our meetings are held about quarterly. But we also have a Google group called the Peninsula Watershed Forum. And from there, you're welcome to join it and be able to post announcements and receive any job descriptions, things like that. So I'm just going to put in the chat the page for the Watershed Forum where you can see the link to previous presentations as well as a link to be able to join the Google group. So our meeting format today is we'll have an overview of our talk and introductions by Clara Elliott with Grassroots Ecology, and our presentations by our two presenters, followed by a question and answer period. And then finally, we'll finish up with an open forum where you can share things that might be of interest to others or announcements that you have. And then we'll close out and talk about our next meeting if we have anything planned for that. Before we get started with Clara introducing the topic and our presenters, I just want to let you know how you can have the best Zoom experience. Use the mute and hide video during the presentation so you can see all of the presentation. Also, if you use the full screen mode, you'll have the biggest image on your screen. And when we get to the Q&A part, you can pose questions by raising your hand. You can also put any comments in the chat and we'll work on looking through there to pose those questions to the presenters if they come up and you don't want to wait to raise your hand. And I just want to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded so we can share it. So go ahead, Claire, and take it away.
Hi, all. I am a senior ecologist with Grassroots Ecology, and I am here to tell you that as the ecologist with Grassroots Ecology, I am constantly promoting the benefits of native plants, and that includes at the top of the vertical height, the trees in our landscapes. And many of you know that urban trees are primarily non-native at this point. So we thought that for the health of watersheds, it would be really important for this group to hear more about how we can improve the ecosystem health through planting trees. So today we're going to have we're doing it a little backwards from usual, going with a very specific example of how trees are being, the tree population is being improved in East Palo Alto with Maya Briones, and then we'll switch to a more general discussion of why trees are beneficial in the urban environment. And that's because Erica was not available to join us until 1 o'clock. So we will see her joining us. But in the meantime, I'm very excited to introduce Maya Briones. We used to work together in the same building when we did work in a building together. And she was a graduate of our California Naturalist class. She's currently a student, master's student at San Jose State University, where she's studying environmental studies with a focus on wildlife conservation and environmental justice. But she's been with Canopy for 3 years, coordinating planting and stewardship programs. She's worked with the County of San Mateo's tree replacement program, looking at the efficacy of their program. And she's also co-authored and published research paper on access to green space. And that's what kind of project she wants to work on in the future. So Maya, take it away.
Okay, can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
The full screen presentation? Okay, Great. Well, it's nice to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Maya Briones, and I am Canopy's Advocacy Associate, formerly Canopy's Community Forestry Manager. And I'm going to talk to you today about, I'm going to focus a lot on urban design and how equity and systemic racism has led to the design of communities that has impacted green space access, and it has led to who gets trees and who doesn't, what that does to communities, what that does to local ecology, and then how we can work together to close what's called the green gap. So our mission is to grow urban tree canopy in Mid-Peninsula communities for the benefit of all. And we envision a day when every resident in the Mid-Peninsula can step outside to walk, play, and thrive under the shade of healthy trees. However, there are many barriers to achieving this mission, primarily stemming from systemic racism, history of prejudice that facilitated urban development design to make it very difficult to bring greenery into working class communities and communities of color, which makes these communities more at risk to climate change impacts. And so we are working to support projects in urban forestry in particular in communities with low canopy cover to reduce these impacts. So quick spotlight, some facts on East Palo Alto, which is one of the cities that I used to plant trees in when I was the community forestry manager. It's been fairly recently incorporated in 1983, so it's a young city. Because it's a young city, it has limited resources and still has a small government, which means there's no parks department and there's no city arborist. And the canopy cover is quite low as well. It is the third most densely populated city in San Mateo County and it's at the crux of multiple climate change and social inequities, including sea level rise and urban heat island effect. So this image, I feel like really is going to summarize what I'm going to talk about today. The bird's eye view looking at the Mid-Peninsula, the two neighboring cities next to East Palo Alto. Palo Alto and Menlo Park are lush green, strong canopy cover. Most places have trees. It's nice to look at. And then East Palo Alto is more gray. So we call this the green gap or the gray-green gap. And so this is what happens when there's disinvestment in communities of color, leads to a lack of services and support. Communities of color tend to have more concrete, less plantable space, smaller parcels. Some people don't have yards. There are a lot of renters who don't get to decide if a tree gets planted or not in their yard. And if there is plantable space, oftentimes that space is paved over for parking. So there's conflict of all these different issues that impacts community health and access to green space. So we have to acknowledge that this is because of racism and classism, which has shaped multiple communities, and the Bay Area is no different. Redlining is a practice that went on in planning departments and urban design, where planners would write in red certain areas that shouldn't be invested in or underinvested in, where it basically was a discriminatory practice of denying services, typically financial, to residents of certain races. And so this looks like banks not giving loans. With no loans, there's lower property tax base, which leads to less funded schools and a less prepared workforce. So all of these things come together to shape what East Palo Alto is today. And I'll add that the addition of Highway 101, which quite obviously separates East Palo Alto from Palo Alto, led to the demolition of East Palo Alto's downtown business area, which further impacted the community. So there's a great TED Talk that I suggest you all watch by Stephen DeBerry. He's an East Palo Alto resident and an anthropologist. He wants to know why the wrong side of the tracks is usually the east side of cities. And so he was looking at disparity by design. And what he found is that saying that we've all heard, wrong side of the tracks, is actually comes from where dirty train smoke would blow. And so that's the wrong side of the tracks. And he presents this example of a campfire. And basically, if we're all sitting around a campfire, who's the one that sits on the side where the smoke blows into? What he found was that it's because of the wind. The Earth rotates counterclockwise, so the North Hemisphere winds flow to the east, and that pulls air pollution to the east. Now, wind is natural. It's not trying to hurt anybody, but how we make decisions and design is intentional. And so this green gap has led to multiple issues, one of them which is extreme heat. And this is a US Forest Service map that shows canopy cover rate. It's a bit outdated, but still essentially the same thing going on right now. The dark blue spaces have the lowest canopy cover of 0 to 11%, and that correlates with very high heat. And urban heat island effect will increase in severity with climate change, particularly impacting communities with less canopy cover, with older homes without AC, and communities with more concrete than green space. Now, these all impacts many things, including community health, issues like respiratory, cardiovascular disease increase in health costs in general, which is especially problematic for working class communities, deteriorating mental health, and decreased outdoor activity, which we saw during COVID was extremely, it was very stark. The communities that had green space could go outside during COVID while others did not have the same access. This also tremendously impacts habitat and ecosystem services. Like Clara said, I'm getting my master's in ecology, and I'm passionate so much about both equity, health of people, and the health of wildlife. Wildlife are our only other living neighbors in our universe, and I believe deserve healthy places to live, but urbanization has fragmented habitat, and the less trees, that means just less habitat. Then that leads to ecosystem services loss, because wildlife and plants provide multiple ecosystem services, such as water retention, flood protection, soil health, the global water cycle, and even local weather patterns. I'm going to leave most of that stuff for Erica to talk to, but I'm happy to talk more about that if we have questions. So this is a screenshot of a street in East Palo Alto, Kavanaugh Drive, where we've been planting for a long time. And the residents here have been wonderful partners for us, working together to get more trees planted in their neighborhood. But the first thing you might notice is that there are trees on one side of the street on the left, and there are no street trees on the right. And this may be because some people say no to trees, that's possible. But the biggest reason why is because there's a water line directly below that planting strip all the way down the street. And so that entire side of the street can't have street trees. And so this goes back to the historic design, the lack of consideration for green space and plantable area access for this community. That we find that a lot of lawns are filled with utility lines. It's easier to get to a utility line that's under dirt than concrete. So, when the community was being built, that might have been the forefront thought. But that restricts what can get planted. A big tree no trees can go on a water line, and a big tree can't be planted near a water line. So that really restricts species list as well. There's also above utility line conflicts. There are trees that work with utility lines, but not all, especially native trees. We don't have native trees that fit well in this sort of landscape. Like I said, small parcels can't really hold big trees. They can't hold oak trees. When there's pipelines everywhere, that further limits the planting size. And so finally, I want to talk about why, I want to point out that there's private space on this picture that looks like prime planting area, right? Both houses in the front have a lawn without trees. However, this is an example of people saying no to trees. And you might ask, why is that? So there was a great article that the New York Times put out this year about why Detroit residents were saying no to free trees from their Canopy-like nonprofit. And the exact same thing is happening, is what we've experienced in East Palo Alto. The biggest predictor of what they found of someone declining a tree was whether that person had negative experiences with trees as one, negative experiences with city workers who didn't take care of the existing trees, that's two, or negative experiences with outsiders like Canopy people, we're not part of the community, who quote, come in, try to do good and only do half the job. So this is really key. When we're talking about greening urban spaces, the community involvement aspect has to be at the forefront. And for many, many years, maybe all the years of urban forestry, it hasn't been. A lot of us know why trees are great, and we think that trees solve everything, but they don't because of how history has played out. When I was canvassing, trying to get folks to say yes to trees, to have a community event, I got yeses, but I also got nos. And some of the examples I heard were, I don't have time to care for this tree. I have multiple jobs. It's expensive. My water bill is going to go up, and pruning it when it gets big is going to be expensive. I don't want it to get big. I don't like trees. They make me feel uncomfortable. Trees make my house feel dark, and I'm worried it's going to fail. And I don't trust city workers to take care of trees in front of my house, so I don't want them near my house. And so most people, pretty much all people in the community, know why trees are good. They know that shade is good. They know that more birds is great and everything, but the barriers to saying yes are often overwhelming. So Canopy's model, how are we approaching all of this? We have three branches of our program: planting, education, and advocacy. Our planting program model is a free tree. It's not just one. People can get as many trees as they want. Many different species to choose from. The planting is free. There's 3 years of free tree care, which is mostly pruning and mulching and weeding, and the resident has to water. So our first few plantings in East Palo Alto were really tight-knit with the city. The mayor at the time, Pat Foster, reached out to Canopy because she was concerned about air pollution and asthma, hospitalizations in kids in East Palo Alto. So that freeway I talked about before of 101, there's a sound wall that blocks the freeway from the neighborhoods. And on the first picture, that's what it looked like. And so all that air pollution and noise pollution came over and impacted the community. But this is how it looks now, where Canopy planted bunch of trees, pretty much all oaks, but a variety. There's a few others that aren't oaks, but vast majority are oaks, because this is one of the few places where oaks can fit and not cause problems. And it's been a really huge success. Canopy, our planting program is available to neighborhoods, schools, and churches. These are pictures from a recent school planting where we had some students of the school volunteer to plant the trees in what was formerly a blacktop. When schools have very few trees and more concrete, just like in neighborhoods, kids don't really want to play. It can really impact kids' health down the line. And so planting trees at schools has been a really great program of ours, getting students involved at a young age, hands-on with trees, understanding their value to their community and also to the larger ecosystem. Tree care is incredibly important. And so if we don't take care of the trees we plant, we've basically not planted any at all, because they'll die. And that's a waste of time and resources. And so tree care is a lot of work, but again, engaging community in understanding how they can take care of their trees so that their trees do live to grow to that size where they give those benefits is really important. We are working on changing our tree care protocol because the handoff from the 3 years of tree care to residents hasn't been the smoothest. So we're currently doing tree care workshops with residents in East Palo Alto, getting really hands-on about tree care, pruning, looking at disease, things like that. And we found pretty early on that working with youth in the community is key, because youth are, they're the community leaders. So they're the ones who are going to grow up and advocate for their community. And so we have an intern program for teens in East Palo Alto. We pay them. They're integral to our work. They are planting leaders. They plant trees. They do tree care. They teach people how to plant trees. And also they engage their community about the benefits of trees, about why trees are valuable, and try, an attempt to smooth out some of those negative experiences people may have. It's much more receptive than an outsider like me coming to tell people why trees are good, when someone from their community who understands their barriers and their concerns much more deeply. We have education, both adult and youth education. And the youth education, I think, is just so important because, like I said, there's been such a history of negative experiences with green space. I didn't even bring up green gentrification for the community of East Palo Alto. And some of that stuff won't necessarily heal, but if we can support positive experiences with youth, growing up to love trees, to love wildlife, to have positive experiences with them, that'll change, that'll help make the change to support urban forestry and climate resiliency in the community. And that's what I just said, creating better experiences for younger generations. We planted at a preschool just the other week and had the preschoolers come out and plant the trees. And it was really, really a wonderful event. Finally, our advocacy, which is now what I do. We do a lot of things, but supporting policy is a big one in East Palo Alto. Canopy applied for a CAL FIRE grant that is now funding the development of East Palo Alto's first urban forestry master plan. And this is a huge step towards creating policy that is both really attentive and detailed about building the urban forest and maintaining it, but also looking at things equitably. We've been talking to residents in the community about what they want to see, what are their concerns. And we have great partners like Hort Science and SFEI, which is where Erica works. And I'm sure she'll tell you more about the development of this plan. So that's what I have for you. Thank you so much for listening. Let me know if you have questions.
Thank you so much, Maya. That was fabulous. I'm really excited to see all the different things you're doing. And I learned a lot. Boy, all of the excuses for not planting trees make so much sense. It's going to be a challenge to get around some of those. We have a few minutes before Erica joins us, and we've had at least one question in the chat from Peter Schultz-Allen asking if we could see a copy of the tree canopy map. Is there a link, Maya, you could find and share in the chat for that? Who generated the map?
So the one with the blue in the heat, that was from the U.S. Forest Service. There is one that was being created for the urban forestry master plan. I think Hort Science has it, but I can look to see if we have that.
Okay, was that for the whole Bay Area?
Yeah, the one with the heat map was for the whole Bay Area, but for East Palo Alto specifically, it's at most 13% canopy cover.
Okay. And Peter goes on to ask, did he see a slide that said EPA has an 11% average canopy coverage? And if not, what is it? Yeah.
Well, that was the 2012 U.S. Forest Service number. The 13% number is from this year.
From a survey done by also the Forest Service?
Hort Science.
Oh, okay. And they're a contractor to
the urban forestry master plan with SFEI.
Okay, cool. All right. Does anybody else want to raise their hand and ask a question or put something in the chat? Oh, we've got one. Yeah. So Juan asks, were most residents who declined trees homeowners or renters?
I would say both. Renters definitely tend to say no because they don't usually get a choice. Though renters do get a say for street trees because it's not the private property, and they can just water a street tree in front of their house. So renters do say yes to street trees, I've found.
Do you have to ask the homeowner for a street tree?
No.
No.
Mhm.
Okay.
Because it's city land.
Okay. Peter's added that UC Davis has some canopy coverage maps.
They
as
do
well.
because of Matt Ritter. He's at, or is it
Oh,
UC
he's at
Davis?
Cal
He's
Poly.
at Cal Poly. That's right.
Larry Ames has his hand up for a question.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Deb. Let's see, can we?
Oh, you muted yourself,
Mute.
Lawrence. There you go.
Okay, yeah, I'm a longtime tree supporter. I've planted a dozen trees on my property and organized a lot of other things. But I do want to point out there are some challenges too. And so part of it is geography and geology. When you're very close to the bay, you have saltwater intrusion. That kind of limits how deep the tree roots can go. So that might be one reason that East Palo Alto has fewer trees than Menlo Park. Menlo Park is higher up. It has better groundwater. Part of the challenge also is we're going to face right now is city efforts to densify, to put in auxiliary dwelling units and fourplexes and so forth. All of those things take people's backyards and put housing on it. That's going to be a challenge for you guys. Is it going to be a real challenge there?
Yeah.
When you're in the hillsides, there's the forest fire efforts to have defensible space around your house to get the trees away from your house. That's also being a challenge. And city budgets, this is one I'm pushing on, is city parks. They have to pay for the water for the trees, and so they're cutting back on that, and the trees die and they don't maintain them. So we're trying to push and make sure they keep watering enough to keep the trees alive. So you got a lot of challenges.
Yeah, there are a lot of
Yes.
challenges. The ADU one is one that worries me, and as do the solar panel issues, because
Yep.
those are both environmentalist against environmentalist issues that are going to be challenging to know which side is best
Yep.
to come down on. But yeah, I think having people like Maya and Erica out there helping to come up with good policies and educating people as to the benefits of the trees is going to be really important to making a good balance. Maya, did you have anything else you wanted to?
We have a few more questions, I think.
Oh,
Juan,
thank you.
do you want to go ahead and ask?
Jean Struthers had her physical hand up before Juan.
Oh, okay. Jean, sorry, Juan. Jean, how about you go first?
We can-
You're muted still.
I'm
Okay. I'm just looking at that poor street that had wires overhead and water lines underneath and wondering if there was any way to convince a city to put a central island down the middle and plant the trees there, because that would shade the street, keep it cooler, and it wouldn't be in anybody's immediate front yard. It
Mhm.
seems to me if there was enough money for it, if
Right.
to make an island.
You know, conversations like that were on the table. They're not anymore. Mostly the conversation was around like moving the water line to the middle of the street. The street is pretty wide, but it's may not be wide enough for a median. Also because parking is such an issue that further closes up the street. But yeah, it's been a problem for that neighborhood. There are a lot of people who are really disappointed and really frustrated with the fact that they can't get anything there. Not even a small tree, can go on a water line. It's just, I don't know that it's illegal, but it's not best management practices and the city won't approve it. So.
But even flowers and small shrubs would make it a happier place.
Actually, we do that with Grassroots Ecology. Anytime I can't plant a tree because of utility, I ask Junko if she has extra plants. And her staff have come out a few times and planted native plants in park strips in East Palo Alto. And that's a great alternative. Like, it doesn't give shade, but it provides more habitat and continues to beautify the space. So it's a solution still.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean.
all right. Well, let's let Juan ask his question, and then let's save the next two for after Erica's talk, because she has now joined us. So Juan, you've had your hand up a while. Can you unmute?
Sure, I was trying to get a better understanding of the intersection of, I think I heard ADUs and trees. And so
Mhm.
are most of the trees that you're planting in, or hoping to plant in front yards or backyards? And is that what you're hearing, that one reason for no is we're planning to add an ADU, for example? An ADU is accessory dwelling unit. Just trying to better
Yes.
understand that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. ADUs and additional housing and densifying is it's a problem for trees, but it's what's needed for the community. It's a complex issue. And so we plant anywhere that there is plantable area that people say yes. Basic backyards are fine, front yards are fine, parks, whatever. Not too often have I been told like, no, we're gonna build an ADU back here. Just maybe 2 or 3 times that I can recall. I think the permitting process for ADUs hasn't been very made clear to the public. I've heard that on forums or in meetings that people want to build ADUs, but they don't necessarily know how to go about it. So, but it is definitely a barrier, a further barrier. You know, like I said, the plantable area that is there is also open space be concreted for more housing and parking, which are desperately needed in the community. So a lot of conflict between issues that are all, you know, equally important.
All right. Well, we'll get back to the other questions after Erica speaks. Maya, can you stick around? I know you're busy with, is this finals week for you?
It is.
Well, do you need to go? Do you want to answer the last couple questions and go study?
I'll stick around for the rest of it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Appreciate you taking the time this week. I know it's challenging. All right, well, I'm going to introduce Erica next. Erica is a scientist with San Francisco Estuary Institute. She has her PhD from UC Berkeley, where she also has been a postdoc. She worked before that with Wildlife Conservation Society and the Peace Corps, both in Africa. So lots of varied experience. She's now the lead scientist for the Urban Nature Lab at the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And she uses data-driven approaches to quantify benefits of nature for biodiversity and human well-being. So she's using science to plan and to provide guidance on how to provide biodiversity and better climate resilience and health for people and nature. So Erica, can you, let me see, I made you a co-host. You should be able to share your screen and we'll spotlight you.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. All right, so this should work.
Yep.
Thumbs up.
Good. Thumbs up.
Good. You can see. All right, putting present mode. All right, so I thank you for this opportunity. Looking forward to talking with you all today. I gave a presentation to this group a few years ago. It's been a while. So it's really nice to be back to talk about what we've been doing since we last spoke. So this talk's really really addressing the question how green is Santa Clara County's forest. So I'm really just, it's almost like a taking the pulse of Santa Clara County, thinking about how it fits in terms of providing nature and trees with the rest of the Bay Area, and also with the rest of sort of other really green places elsewhere in the world. So I'm going to be focusing specifically on what urban nature can do for biodiversity and human health. But first, just taking a step back, I'm going to be talking about urban nature beyond trees. So thinking about not just the trees, but also the understory. So the trees and the understory together produce greenness, which is measured using a metric called normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI, which I'm going to be talking about a fair bit. And then sort of a smaller set of both the understory and the trees is the native vegetation. So I'll be talking also about what do native species do specifically, and how are we doing on those by metrics of measuring native species in Santa Clara County compared to the rest of the Bay Area. So again, just focusing specifically on the biodiversity benefits of trees, understory, and native species, and also the human health benefits that come along with those, with the urban nature in whatever its form. So just to start off with a little bit of context, a little while ago, we did a kind of comparison to precedents from around the world, looking at what are the greenest cities, and what are the metrics that we can pull out associated with that greenness. So these are some six examples of pretty green places. So thinking, so we pulled out information on their population size, the population density, the green capita. So that's the essentially the square meters available of green space per person. So it's the greenness divided by the population density, or the total population size. And the green percentage is the total area of that's occupied by green space. And in this case, we're talking specifically about parks. This is a park access measurement, and then tree canopy cover. So putting Santa Clara County in context, and I will say this is Santa Clara County it's a different spatial scale. So Santa Clara County includes lots of cities, so this is not directly comparable, but this is including just the urbanized area of Santa Clara County. So is roughly equivalent in terms of metrics. So you can see that in terms of green space available, Santa Clara County has 25% green space, which is pretty good. It's comparable to Washington, DC, but has a much lower canopy cover than many of these other cities. So in terms of the human health benefits of nature, I'm going to be talking about the research that's been done in the fields of public health, medicine, and epidemiology over the past couple of decades that have been thinking specifically about what does nature do for human health, and what are the different ways we can measure and quantify that. So that literature is really broad and sort of multidisciplinary, but it's typically done by people in the fields of health, and usually not by ecologists. And so the measures of how urban nature is measured is often pretty coarse. And that's why I'm going to be talking about this metric NDVI, because the most common metric for measuring the nature, the connection between nature and human health, is this greenness metric, which is just measures the total volume of the vegetation available. So really crude from an ecological perspective way of thinking about how much urban nature is available to people. Within that science, there has been a little bit of research thinking about the specific health benefits associated with native species and habitats, and then a fair amount looking specifically at the human health benefits of trees. And so looking across these three different categories of what are the health benefits of greenness, of native species and habitats, and trees, that's what's on this slide. So on the left, there's many benefits to human health that have been associated with this greenness metrics, which I'll show you on the next slide. For the association between native species and habitats and human health, there is a little bit there is a little bit of research in this domain, and there's essentially kind of three categories, I would say, of potential connections between native species and native habitats and human health. The first is that there's increasing research showing that there's a connection between the biodiversity of the nature that you engage with and healthy microbiome colonization, which is associated with reductions in the probability of some chronic illnesses like the development of allergies and asthma. The second category is the general research around the feelings of restoration and mental health benefits of nature. So increasingly, there's been a bunch of research it's been several studies that have shown that the feeling of restoration that we get from nature is better in more biodiverse spaces. So if you compare going out for a walk, the feeling of restoration you get in going out for a walk in a park that's just lawn and maybe a couple of tree species with a more ecologically biodiverse, sort of more natural habitat, that your feeling of restoration is better in that second walk. And then there's a sort of a third category of potential benefits, which are not super well explored, which is essentially the sense of place benefits of encountering, engaging with native species. And so there's been some research looking at sort of really charismatic, iconic species and the way that the presence of those species can connect people to a particular place. And that feeling of place attachment can itself be associated with some mental health benefits. The connection between trees and mental and health benefits is pretty broad. There's quite a few different ways that trees benefit human health, including reduction in the probability of asthma, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, overweight, obesity, and body mass index. There's been some research on babies born small for their gestational age, and a bunch of different categories of human health benefit as well. And then the final category, reducing UV exposure in children. This is an interesting one, that finding that large trees that produce a lot of shade, sort of obvious, but if you have large trees close to playgrounds and schoolyards, and that they reduce UV exposure in children. So this is the, going back to the NDVI and Greenness metric, this is the list of human health benefits that have been associated with this broad category of greenness, which again is just the volume of vegetation. It includes both trees and understory. And it's, like I was saying, kind of crude and is usually estimated and quantified using remote sensing satellite imagery, high resolution satellite imagery. You can see that sort of broadly grouped by categories: physical health, social ties, physical activity, violence, reduction in probability of violence, child development, and mental health. Huge number of different types of research that have found different types of human health benefits of being in a neighborhood that is greener. So recently we sort of piled into this research field, this like really crowded field of research, study, and inquiry to do our own research looking at the connection between nature inequity and COVID cases. So this is a paper that was just published in this fall in Nature Sustainability, in the journal Nature Sustainability, where we looked at, we looked first at the broad, the distribution of nature across urbanized areas across the whole United States. And we found really persistent and across the whole US inequity in nature access along both racial and income lines. So higher income and more white block groups, census block groups, had more tended to have higher, more greenness in them. We then took a subset of data that was available at the county, at the zip code scale across 17 states, and looked at the connection to COVID cases, because we know that COVID is also disproportionately affecting people of color and low income communities, and COVID is also so those communities, the communities that are hardest hit by COVID, we suspected were the very same ones that also had the least nature access. So we showed that that was in fact true. So the first kind of finding of this paper with respect to COVID was that the communities that had the least access to nature also had the highest burden of COVID. So that's again sort of obvious. These two independent spheres of research have been finding that nature is inequity. On the one hand, nature is inequitably distributed. On the other hand, COVID is disproportionately affecting low income and communities of color. So we sort of brought those two fields of research together and showed that these communities are the same. But then the other more surprising finding was that we found that even once you statistically account for the variation, the demographic and economic, socioeconomic variation in communities, there is still a greenness effect. So accounting for all of those other statistical things that we think are confounded with COVID cases, greener neighborhoods had less COVID in them, all else being equal. So that is a pretty surprising finding that could speak again to the protective benefits that nature can provide. Potentially, yeah, I can tell you more about my thoughts on that if anyone wants to hear them. So just thinking about the relationship So I'm going to jump in now to a couple of different analyses that I've done using really broad scale data to compare Santa Clara County to the rest of the Bay Area. But before I do that, just speaking again to what is this greenness metric and what is it telling us? You might be asking yourself, okay, well, how does greenness compare to relate to trees? What's the relationship between tree canopy cover and greenness? So I just wanted to provide some context setting here. Greenness, this NDVI metric, which varies from 0 to 1, is related but not completely related to tree canopy cover. So what you can see is that at above about greenness NDVI of about 0.4, tree canopy cover is pretty closely correlated with greenness, but at very low levels of NDVI, tree canopy cover is just really, really low. And so here, NDVI, this variation between 0 and 0.4 in NDVI is really capturing smaller vegetation and understory vegetation. So thinking about how Santa Clara County compares to the rest of the Bay Area in terms of greenness, this is data set looking across 3,825 block groups across the Bay Area. And what you can see is that the greenness the average greenness is very similar to, so both the Bay Area and Santa Clara County have average greenness values of about 0.33 or around 0.33. But you can see that this difference between the green line and the gray line is the difference in the amount of block groups that are at the high end. And what you can see, basically what this is telling us is that there's just a smaller fraction of block groups in Santa Clara County that are very, very green, above greenness values of 0.5. So definitely room to grow here. If you're looking specifically at the tree canopy cover, so this is the same kind of density plots, but showing tree canopy cover instead. Tree canopy cover values are very similar between Santa Clara County and the rest of the Bay Area, and again, average less than 5%. So to give you a sense of what is this greenness, what does this greenness value feel like on the ground? Because it's very hard. It's very easy to visualize in your head what is 10 or 20% tree canopy cover, but really hard to picture what a 0.2 NDVI, unitless NDVI value really means in terms of what it feels like on the ground. So this is comparing two block groups. These are actually from San Francisco with a difference in NDVI of 0.1. So you can see it's 0.1 difference in NDVI is pretty meaningful in terms of what it feels like on the ground to walk along a street with 0.1 versus 0.18 versus 0.28 NDVI. Similarly, this is on the bottom 0.16 compared to 0.25 on the top. And again, definitely a different meaningful difference in terms of human experience on the ground. Okay, so what about biodiversity? So here, what I wanted to, maybe a lot of people in this group who have heard me banging on about biodiversity and trees and nature for years now. So I hope this isn't too repetitive with things you've heard me or Robin Gersinger or my colleagues say before. But I'm just going to speak to a tiny slice of the kind of biodiversity benefits that can be provided by urban nature. And really here I'm thinking mostly about, we're kind of zeroing in and focusing mostly on the native component of the vegetation, both vegetation and trees, because native species do, as far as we know from the science, a better job of supporting biodiversity as a whole. And there's good reasons why we think that's true. So we just published another paper this year called The Biological Desert's Fallacy in the journal Bioscience, where we looked at, this was a theoretical kind of perspective piece where we were looking at asking the question, what are cities providing in terms of biodiversity support if you're thinking about how cities sit in their regional context. So if you have a city in between agriculture and hills, for example, as you do in the South Bay, what is that city doing for the species that are occupying that big regional landscape? And we came up with a couple of different mechanisms for how cities are potentially benefiting regional species pools. So this is an attempt to sort of get us out of, there's been, you know, the majority of the science in urban ecology is focused on the negative effects of cities on biodiversity. And of course, cities are negative for biodiversity kind of in aggregate. But in that broad categorization, there's also a lot being missed, because despite the fact that cities are on average bad for biodiversity, there's also these weird examples of species that are doing really well in cities. So this is an attempt to push us to think more broadly about, well, what are those examples telling us about the role that cities can provide in their region in terms of supporting regional biodiversity conservation. And one of the mechanisms that we came up with that we thought was really important and really applicable to the South Bay and the Bay Area is, and documented by some research, is that because cities are created in non-random locations, so they tend to be found more, they're usually closer to the coast, they're usually flatter, they're often on alluvial floodplains, and they're usually closer to rivers than just a random place on the landscape. And because cities tend to be sited in non-random locations, there's evidence that they tend to harbor regionally rare habitat types. And those regionally rare habitat types can serve a really important role in supporting regional species pools, because they can have the potential to support unique groups of species. So in the Bay Area, this is a really, really sort of distinctive phenomenon in Silicon Valley. The sort of environmental gradients that you see across the landscape in elevation, topography, soil type, and groundwater means that what is on the valley floor is just not the same as what's in the hills. And to the extent that the valley floor supports unique suites of habitats and unique species, those functions are not being provided by the hills, because the hills are so dramatically environmentally different in terms of the environmental topographic gradients, et cetera. And so one of the obvious habitat types that is unique to the valley floor, not totally restricted to the valley floor, but was historically common on the valley floor and rare everywhere else, is our willow groves. So willow groves are found along the edge of the bay, and then also down along in the river corridors along Guadalupe River. So these regionally rare willow groves were really important for supporting migratory songbirds. Large willow groves were specific to the valley floor historically and were not common in the surrounding landscape. So to the extent that we have willow groves close to the bay today, they are supporting unique suites of species, including willow flycatchers, which use willow groves as stopover habitat in willow grove. And willow flycatchers have been found to refuel. They find more insects in willow groves and refuel faster, which sets them up for completing their migration more successfully when they're refueling in willow groves compared to other types of habitats. So looking at the distribution of willow flycatchers today, and this is using citizen science eBird data, these red hotspots are the place. So hotspots are where willow flycatchers are being found. Neutral is where they're not really found in cold spots or places that they appear to avoid. So you can see the distribution of willow flycatchers in the Bay Area is mostly restricted to the area around the bay, with a couple of exceptions. If you zoom in on those hotspots, you can see that if you zoom in really farther than here, you can see that they're mostly along the river riparian corridors, and also in flood detention basins that mostly contain willows. So this is a good example of sort of these naturally colonized by willows flood detention basins that are performing this really unique on the landscape type of support for a species that is using these landscapes for long distance migrations. So I will just finish this section on biodiversity by thinking specifically about native trees. So we published a report a few years ago on reoaking in Silicon Valley. We found that there were just a really big transformation in the species composition compared from the historical to the native to the contemporary landscape. And the big change is most of the native trees have been are now gone, and now there's a huge diversity of different non-native trees in the modern landscape, around 400 species. And this was data taken from Palo Alto. So expanding from that original sort of look at native trees and looking at cities across the Bay Area, we've been over the past couple of years accumulating data sets of street tree inventories from cities around the Bay Area. And we now have enough data from enough different cities to be able to do some kind of interesting comparisons. So I'm color coding the street tree inventory data based on the proportion native species. So the lightest is between 0 and 5% native. The middle is between 5 and 10, and the highest is greater than 10% native. You can see that San Francisco and San Jose are falling out. It's having the lowest proportion native trees. East Palo Alto and Sunnyvale are between 5 and 10, and then Mountain View, Palo Alto, Cupertino, Redwood City, and Hayward are all doing relatively well at 13%, 10 to 13 to 18% native, which is, good by Bay Area standards, but still relatively low. So the final thing I'll say on this topic is that urban density really matters. So I'm not going to speak to this very much, but when you look at both the provision, the amount of open space, the proportion space that is non-sealed, non-impervious, not buildings and not impervious cover, there's a strong relationship between that open space proportion and population density, and same for on the right. It's the same graph for tree canopy cover. And what you can see is that above a certain population density threshold, you're really no longer getting above 20% tree canopy. So I won't speak too much more about that now, but this strongly suggests that there's sort of an upper limit to how much we can densify without really constraining our ability to functionally provide nature in urban landscapes. So I have a few thoughts on climate resilience, but I might just, I know I'm running up against time here, so I might just skip through this, and we can come back to it if anyone specifically wants to hear more what I have to say on that topic. But sort of the take-home message messages from this are that we should increase greenness by planting trees and other understory, especially in places that are not as green. We should be thinking about integrating native habitat elements into the urban landscape, supporting willows and flood detention basin and other rare habitat types. We should be planting more native trees in cities with few of them. So specifically Sunnyvale, San Jose, East Palo Alto, to bring up levels to compare to the rest of cities in the Bay Area. And then we shouldn't, my sort of take home with climate resilience is we shouldn't give up on native trees because of climate change. Okay. So we have a couple of ongoing projects and partners in the South Bay, including just wanted to acknowledge our work with Canopy on the East Palo Alto Urban Forest Master Plan, and the East Palo Alto Parks Master Plan, the Ecology for Health Project, and the Sunnyvale specific plan from the city of Sunnyvale. So, okay, so with that, I will say thank you, and I'll take questions. And I'm sorry if I ran over a bit, but
no, that was fine. Thank you, Erica. So we have some questions in the chat. If people want to raise their hands or add to the chat, that would be another good way to go.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
We had a question about your papers. Are they all available on the SFEI?
Yeah. Yes.
Publications? That's where we go, right? To your website and then to publications. So
yes,
even like your bioscience paper would be there.
Yeah, I can. That one's publicly. They're all open access, and I can also follow up by email.
We can put that in the chat here in a minute.
Yeah, if anybody finds it, Biological Deserts Fallacy should pull it up.
Okay, great. This might have been more of a question for Maya, but do you know the organization Tree Equity Score?
The one by American Forests.
Do they? American Forest has something called a Tree Equity Score?
Yeah.
That was from Robin, I think. I scrolled away. No,
I don't know if they wanted to
if they want to
hear more about it.
unmute and ask more details. Was that you, Robin? In the meantime, we have a question from Ron Horry. Does urban tree cover correlate to average rainfall? Oh, here's more. I'm sorry, Ron, let's go back to Robin because she's put in the chat that she attended a one-day conference of the California Urban Forest Council where Matt Ritter from Cal Poly was pushing underutilized trees. He was interested in species that will be able to tolerate our climate in 50 years, and provide carbon sequestration. Yeah, I'm a little personally worried. I'm curious about both Maya and Erica's thoughts about Matt Ritter's pushing species that might survive better with climate change that are not locally.
Right. I have a lot of thoughts about it. I feel like, because I'm sort of between worlds, I'm getting a master's in ecology and I'm doing this work in urban forestry, which means I'm planting mostly non-native trees. Because like I said in my presentation, there's not a lot of room for native trees in places like East Palo Alto. There's not enough space, plantable area for native trees. Can't really plant sycamores because they're riparian. Buckeyes are summer deciduous, so they don't provide shade. Arbutus menziesii doesn't do well. Like there's lots of reasons why native trees don't really necessarily do well in certain urban landscapes. So Matt Ritter, his book and his webpage is something we go to a lot to learn about trees. However, I think it still is very, very important that we do what we can to provide habitat and increase biodiversity levels within cities. For all the reasons Erica said, biodiversity underpins ecosystem services. If you want to put it from an anthropogenic perspective, why people should care. Biodiversity equals resilient communities. So a biodiverse urban forest isn't going to get wiped out by one disease, for example, and pests. So it's very complex. Native trees where they can get planted, I think should be, but there are a lot of places where they can't.
Oh, and there's a lot of concern about climate resiliency, whether we ought to be planting trees from farther south. I think Australia is a little too far south myself. But I don't know, Erica, do you want to weigh in on the question of climate resiliency and going with more non-native trees to provide for that?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll maybe share this slide that I was going to show. So this is showing the distribution. This is using climate models and future species distribution modeling to try to predict what is the future range going to be for some of our native trees. And so this is just exemplary. This is not an exhaustive body of work by any means. This is pretty rudimentary, but the species models are taken from the forecast project of the USDA Forest Service. And what you can see is that there are some species that will be where the predictions in the Bay Area are that species that are not that suitable now will be suitable in the future. So Engelmann oak and blue oak are two examples of that. In the middle are species distributions for the future in 2050, where the species its range still overlaps with the Bay Area. So the Valley oak, California black oak, and coast live oak are three examples. And then there are species on the right for which the range is predicted to move northward enough that the Bay Area is no longer super suitable for those species. And two examples are Pacific madrone and coast redwood. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing that now. But the main thing that I want to communicate when talking about this is that I think there's a lot of throwing out the baby with the bathwater going on in this conversation about climate resilient, what are going to be the climate resilient trees of the future. And by that, I mean, the thing that I hear, and I hear this all the time, is like the trees of the future are not the trees of the present. But if you look at what the science of the science around the connection between climate change and biodiversity, what you see there is that what scientists are broadly saying is that with climate change, some species will need to shift their ranges. Other species will go extinct. Other species will need to adapt in situ, and all possible combinations of that will happen. And so what that means is that while some species we may need to help transport further north, and some species we may need to import, there are also plenty of species for which conservation in situ, so in where they are now, where they're currently living, is also going to be really important, both for helping them move to track climate change if they need to, because we probably can't do enough assisted colonization to move all the species around that we need to, and for helping to support the species that will be viable in the future. So when I say throwing out the baby with the bathwater, what I hear a lot is this kind of notion that, oh my gosh, all of our current trees are going to go extinct and they're not going to be suitable for in our current locations. We need to totally import and totally overhaul our forests. And that sort of, to me, misses the point that there's a lot of things that we actually need to conserve in place. And that the same conservation measures that we're using now are also going to be important for helping species adapt to climate change. And in the context specifically of the urban forest and thinking about what does this mean for native trees and what does this mean for the proportion of native trees and non-native trees, I would say the proportion of native and non-native trees I just showed you is dramatically already weighted towards non-native trees, and so it isn't going to help the native species very much to just continue to import and add more non-native trees to the mix. If we do that, we will reduce the proportion of native trees down to zero, and then we'll be providing no support for the species that may need it, that are local in our urban ecosystems. And so thinking back to that context of the bioscience manuscript, the diagram that I was showing about the sort of city, thinking about what the city is doing with respect to its landscape, and you think, okay, the coast live oak can only it's going to live in the hills over here, and it's going to live over here in the hills, but it can't live on the valley floor. It can't live in the place where the city is because we've excluded it completely. Well, that is going to have consequences for the species that could be supported, their ability to kind of move from one hillside to the other across that landscape if there are literally no native trees on the valley floor in the local in the city. So I guess what I would say is we could do everything that Matt Ritter is suggesting and still increase the number of native trees that we're planting and still have an urban forest that is vastly dominated by the trees from Australia that we think are going to be climate resilient. But we'd be doing it in a way that would support some of the local native biodiversity as well. So I don't think that planting native trees now is going to be a threat to having our forests dominated by non-native species. They kind of already are dominated by non-native species.
Well, especially when it would mean putting a much more climate adaptable tree in place of a silver maple or some East Coast species that a lot of cities are planting now. So yeah. Our native species are a big step towards climate adaptation. A lot of them are. I mean, big leaf maple, yeah, maybe we don't plant, in upland hot parts of the city, but yeah, there's a lot of our native species that are more adaptable than a lot of the common street trees that are in use today. And I always have to throw in my concern about the invasive species. So I'm not sure that Matt Ritter is paying enough attention to that because a number of the eucalyptus species are fairly invasive. And, we have other trees like tree of heaven and privet that are spreading rapidly in the cities and aren't providing any ecosystem services besides carbon sequestration and shade. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to take a little bit of issue with Matt Ritter's snarky comment that we shouldn't be worrying about whether the insects can adapt.
Robin has had her hand up, Claire.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm having trouble seeing the hands up. Thank you, Deb. Robin, did you want to
Yeah.
unmute?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to follow up on this whole thing with Matt Ritter, and I, went to another webinar with Igor. I can't remember his last name from.
I heard Igor too.
Yeah, from UC Berkeley, and I mean the fact that Matt Ritter said, I mean, I was the one that put the comment in the chat saying, what about the insects? And he says it doesn't matter. But he basically, if you listen to the recording, which I was going to put the link, but I didn't, he basically says, who cares about the insects? And it's like, without insects, we don't exist as a species. So we can't have that attitude. And these very influential people like Igor and Matt Ritter are really promoting these trees that I just think somebody with, I mean, maybe Erica, maybe it's you, because you have the science to back up what you're saying. It's like somebody has to push back on this, because I mean, I'm on the urban forest committee in my little town of El Cerrito. We got a grant proposal, we had a potential grant for planting trees, came from Cal Fire. The only, half of the trees that we were going to be able to plant, we had to plant them, and they were from Matt Ritter's list of underutilized species, and they were from Australia. And it's like, we already have a problem of eucalyptus in our open space. And he said, oh, well, those aren't the same, these are better eucalyptus or whatever. But we decided we didn't want that grant. But other cities are taking that grant. And I think it's a much more nuanced, situation than any of those guys are talking about. And I don't think they're looking at the whole ecosystem. They're very focused on a few aspects of it. And I think somebody needs to take them up on it and make an argument that, yes, maybe there is a place for some of that, but there's also a place for other things too. And don't be so one-sided in their promotion of stuff. And I think it's really significant, because I've seen them twice now, and all, everybody's freaking out about climate change and, what should we be planting, what should we be doing? And they're the ones that have taken the stage, and they're the ones that people are listening to. And I think there needs to be some pushback.
Thank you for saying that, Robin. Yeah, so the insects can't, we shouldn't care about the insects. The insects are the base of the food web. They support the birds. So if you want any kind of trophic biodiversity, you have to have the insects. They're the bottom of the food chain.
Well, they support us. Without us, I mean, if you listen to Doug Tallamy, and I even said in the chat on that talk, I said, Doug Tallamy is pushing natives because it supports other critters and stuff. And he said, well, I know Doug Tallamy, I don't agree with him. So he flat out, Matt Ritter just flat out does not, think about ecosystems as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, okay, a couple things to say. I do have a lot of thoughts on this, because I have this conversation very frequently. And I just gave a talk to the Urban Forestry Council for San Francisco a few weeks ago, where I had a very similar conversation, and Igor was present. He's a member of the Urban Forestry Council. What I have observed since I published the Reoking report, I've been interacting with urban forestry people, and I have realized that urban forestry is not ecology, that urban foresters are not trained in ecology, that they really don't have that content. It's just not their training. They're thinking about infrastructure conflicts and a whole set of things that are not the same as ecology. So it's not very surprising that the main voices in urban forestry don't necessarily have the ecology context in mind, and it isn't a priority. It also follows from, so the reason I titled the paper, the bioscience paper, The Biological Desert's Fallacy, is because there is this notion that cities are urban biological deserts. And what follows from that notion is the idea that we don't have to care about what's in them from an ecological or biodiversity perspective. We can do anything we want to them, and it doesn't matter because they're not supporting biodiversity. But what we've been finding from urban ecology, 30, 40 years of urban ecology research, and we found that actually that's not true. There's tons of biodiversity that's thriving in our midst, despite all of our attempts to eliminate it. It's there. And as we're thinking about what are our conservation values for the future in the 21st century, I don't believe that we will be able to set aside enough land on Earth to support all the biodiversity on Earth outside, constrained and confined to protected areas. I think protected areas will be too small, and that we are going to need to think more about how our human modified landscapes, including agriculture and cities, can play a role in supporting the biodiversity, because we will never give biodiversity enough space if we're leaving protected areas just for the biodiversity of the world. We're too greedy. So we need our urban landscapes to play a role in supporting the species that they can. And
thank you. Yeah, that's, I was gonna make sure somebody said that, because if you listen to people like Gretchen Daly, I mean, our urban landscapes are growing at such a rate that, yeah, it's really important that we include ecosystem services within them. So we need to turn it over to our general sharing opportunity that we always have with these fora. But I would like to offer to leave the meeting open for a few minutes for people who want to get back to the subject. I'd like to talk to Robin and Linda, who've had some comments in the chats about species choices and such. Thank you so much, Erica and Maya. Those were both great presentations. I think we all learned a lot. We will share the videos that we've recorded for people who've missed it. And I believe also you both would be okay with sharing the PDFs of your slides with us. Maya, is that okay with you too?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine.
Okay, great. If you can send us, then we can put it in a link to an email to everybody, because we've had a request for that. So I'm going to turn it back over to Deb to run our sharing session for the last 10 minutes. But if you want to stay on for a minute to go back to the, if you have time about native trees, then we'll have that opportunity too.
Great, thanks Claire, and thanks to our speakers. We don't have a presentation scheduled, but we've been looking at a number of topics. So if you have some topics specifically that you're interested in hearing about, let us know. We are considering a couple of watersheds that we will be working on as well for a forum. So, and also if there are speakers in particular that you would like to hear from, let us know. Right now, let's do an open forum. So this is an opportunity for anyone to share about your program, what your status is with any events that are coming up. You can also ask other participants that are on the call any questions that you might have. So we can just kind of go and talk to each other a little bit about what's going on with our groups. This is something we used to do in person. And it was so nice because we used to be able to, you know, have these one-on-one conversations in the group, but doing it in this format's a little different. So here's the space to do it.
Is Bill still around, Bill Lakem? He was here.
I'm here.
Oh, okay. How about give us a quick update on your foxes?
The foxes themselves?
Yeah.
Oh,
Just generally, how's the population going?
I only have two out there, two foxes that I'm paying attention to. That's about it. They haven't done anything that is really noteworthy. They're just running around out there and having a good time. They like each other too. I can tell that.
Are they different genders? Are there going to be babies?
Oh, well, yeah, they're a mated pair.
Oh, okay, good.
but they should have had pups 2 years ago. They haven't had a litter yet. And I'm beginning to think that there's something wrong with their reproductive systems.
Too bad.
So that
Maybe they just need to mature.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah. Can I interject two other things?
Sure.
Of course.
We're working to put together a proposal for restoration along the edge of the San Francisco Bay, and we're putting that together. And in February, actually February 10th, I will be in Zurich attending the opening of a project called Triggered by Motion, that I that I contributed to for a year and a half. And so I'm going to be in Zurich at the opening of that event. It's going to be in San Francisco as well, not in February, but later in the year. It'll probably wind up in San Francisco at the Academy of Art, Academy of Sciences.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that, Bill. And while we're on the subject of wildlife in motion, Merav, do you want to talk about your newt surveys?
Sure, thanks, Clara. Yeah, I wanted to talk about that for a minute. So I've been organizing wildlife, well, I guess roadkill surveys in Lexington Reservoir and Los Gatos for the past few years. And there's an important meeting coming up this Wednesday evening. Mid-Peninsula Open Space District is going to discuss a population study they did last year and possible mitigation options to move forward with. So they finally realized that we actually need to do something about these newts. We count at least 5,000 dead newts every year for the past few years. And now they realize that there is a problem, and if we continue this way, the population will go extinct in the next some years. You know, there's some argument about that. But anyway, if you have time, you can write a public comment. I'll post a link to text that Deb wrote. We all wrote it together about the newts. You could post a public comment. You don't actually have to be at the meeting. It would be great if you'd be there. You could also talk. It's all virtual anyway. But you can post a public comment just saying shortly that you are concerned about the newts and you would like to see that they actually do something about it. And that will be great. So I'll post something about that. So that was one thing. And also, if people are interested, it's a very interesting project and we need more volunteers. I'm happy to either, you know, if you know other people who might be interested, or if you're interested, I'll write my email address there. So if anyone would like to contact me about that. And one last thing, I have a BioBlitz on Saturday in Laguna Seca in North Coyote Valley, which should be fun. We still have some space. So if you're interested, that would be awesome.
Hey, and Rob, just to confirm, that's the December 8th Mid-Penn meeting?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll post everything in the chat in a second.
Anything from California Native Plant Society or Junko or Jerry want to mention anything coming up with Grassroots Ecology?
I have a book.
Jean's sharing The Nature of Oaks.
Yeah, by Doug Tallamy.
Oh, a new one by Doug Tallamy.
A lot of bugs in it.
Yeah, we need a West Coast Doug Tallamy. I've been wondering.
Yeah, we
that for
do.
years.
We do. Because he talks about all the oaks that grow on his property in Delaware somewhere.
They are an ecosystem all to their own selves, that's for sure.
It is the same idea, though.
Claire, we've been talking about maybe doing a project that's would directly measure the biodiversity that oaks and native trees support in our urban landscapes in the Bay Area.
Great.
Because we don't, so we might do it in collaboration with the Urban Forestry Council in San Francisco. So if this group was interested in being involved somehow, maybe I'll reach out.
That would be great. And Erica, you could be the next Doug Ptolemy of the West Coast. You just need to write that book that's
Right.
accessible to non-scientists.
Yeah, I need to do the data analysis first.
Cool.
Another thing I'd like to share is that the city of San Jose has got a forestry management plan that apparently is quite flawed, and I've been part of trying to get comments in. I'm not sure exactly the date. Somebody on here might know, but there is a date that it's going to be heard on the council meetings. And if people have some comments to make on that, that would be great. They have not, and the forestry plan did not include conversations with large stakeholders like BTA or Valley Water. And so it's the group is trying, DOT is trying to push through a plan that doesn't involve these large stakeholders as part of the planning process. It seems a bit flawed. So
The worst part of that is that what they eventually did engage stakeholders, for example, the California Native Plant Society. We sent in multiple comments. We had conversations with them. We talked endlessly about biodiversity, not just in the urban forest, but in what the urban forest supports. And nothing of that has made it into the final plan. It is the most frustrating experience I have ever had advocating with an agency. And they were so pleasant and, oh yes, please keep sending us your comments. You know, there's still time to get something in. None of it made it in. And it's beyond frustrating.
That's disappointing to hear. The same thing is going to be happening with the city of Palo Alto with the urban forestry master plan. There's plans to upgrade it and attempts also to elevate the level of the urban forestry position so that more can get done.
So I think since it's 2 o'clock that we will wrap up formally. And if people would like to stay on and if Erica's available and others want to continue the conversation about trees, that's great. So thank you everyone for participating. And if you join the Google group, then you'll be able to have access to the presentations and share in any conversation. And I will put that in the chat for those of you who may not already be on it.